You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Let's talk about this World Health Organization business here. Bruce Pardy had a great piece in the National Post about this, where he talks about why I think people in Canada and around the world should be very concerned. He is a law professor at Queen's University and the executive director of Rights Probe, and it is always good to see him. Bruce, welcome back. Thanks for coming on today.
Hello, Andrew. Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
There's always this battle whenever we see these international agreements where anytime someone raises alarm bells, as you rightly have, you get people saying, oh, it's non-binding. What's the big deal? Don't worry about it. And I say, well, if it's, so insignificant, why bother doing it at all? But why is it you find this one to be of particular concern?
Well, this is part of the plan for the next time around, yes? So I think it goes like this. The WHO takes responsibility for driving the boat. They get authority to declare when a public health emergency happens, and they get to make recommendations that will be binding. And the countries will promise to put the binding recommendations into place in their own countries. Now, as you say, the control is basically still in the hands of the individual governments in those countries. But the game here is that I think those governments will use the WHO's recommendations as cover for their own decisions, as in, well, I'm sorry, but the WHO has recommended lockdown, so you have to stay in your house, and we're sorry, but it's out of our hands. So in this way, they're sloughing off responsibility for making the hard calls, even though hard calls is what they want to make. Governments are always anxious to avoid responsibility, and this is one of the ways they're going to do it.
That's an incredible point. And I think that was one of the big disgraces of the pandemic response. I mean, around the world, but certainly in Canada, is where you had governments hiding behind public health bureaucrats. It happened federally with Theresa Tam. It happened in pretty much every single province. And one of the big issues from a policy perspective is that public health bureaucrats, that they have their place. I would say it's a far smaller place now that I would give them than I would have given them 5-6 years ago. But they're very singularly focused on one metric. They're not focused on constitutionality. They're not focused on the economy. They're not focused on mental health. They're not focused on child development. They're focused on, getting cases down, even if we could agree on what a case was and how significant it was. And it's very dangerous for people that we elect to make the decisions, which we think are going to come from other experts. Like, a response should have been, we hear what the public health doctor has to say. We hear what the economist has to say. We hear what the child psychiatrist has to say, and then we make a decision on balance. Now, maybe they wouldn't make the right one, but at least there would be a clear delineation of who made the responsibility. It's incredibly dangerous, as you point out, to hide behind the experts, which is really what they're agreeing to do here.
That's exactly right. It's a plan to hide, and I agree with what you said, but I have an even more basic objection, which is that there are some of these decisions that ought not to have been able to be made, in the sense that they told people what to do with their own lives and instructed them on what risks that they were allowed to take themselves, which is not a thing that any kind of official ought to have in my books. But yes, this is going to change the focus from the local officials who are exercising their discretion to giving them an excuse for saying that they really have no choice, which is absolutely not correct. So there's one of the arguments against this planned regime from the WHO is that it will override our sovereignty and it will suspend our constitution. And those two things are really not quite true. Yes, it will affect us detrimentally. Yes, it will appear that we will lose control over the rules that are being applied to us. All those things are true. But the real people to finger in this, it's not just the WHO. It is actually our own officials, our own politicians, our own government, who, number one, are eager to sign on to this, and number two, who actually still have the authority to decide, and to decide to what extent they're going to recognize our rights and freedoms, our civil liberties, and the ones who are failing to weigh all the factors that you mentioned. They are the ones who are really at fault, and they are the ones who are democratically accountable to us. The officials in the WHO, the bureaucrats in the WHO, are not accountable to us. They are accountable to the countries that put together this agreement. So our first line of attack, if you like to put it that way, are the people who purport to represent us, and they are the ones who are falling down on the job.
Yes, and we've already seen in one notable way I'll describe momentarily where our government is all too willing to go along with this, and that's on regulating discourse. So in this draft agreement, it says that countries would commit to censoring, quote, false, misleading, misinformation, or disinformation, unquote. Now, these are terms we've heard the federal government in Canada talk about warranting a government response already, and we know that the government in Canada is doing an overhaul of internet regulations as we speak. Well, here we have a prime example where these two agendas seem to be aligned already.
It's perfect. It's perfect. I mean, can't you just imagine the government saying, well, we're concerned about this, but the WHO basically has told us that this kind of information should not be allowed because it interferes with global health. Global health, my goodness. Well, we can't ignore that. So we're going to have to put in place regulations that require you to or prohibit you from questioning the narrative that the WHO has put forward as to what's important to keep people alive. I'm right. So it's a perfect excuse for the government to do what it already wants to do, and in that way make it appear as though they're not the one making the call.
I just checked on YouTube where we're streaming live right now, because every now and then we get like the big disclaimer that YouTube throws up on our shows, depending on what we're talking about. And I don't know if they put it up live or if they put it up after the fact. We don't have one now, but often, no,
Right.
We didn't get it yet, Sean. But like if you talk about climate change, you'll get like a disclaimer. If you talk about COVID, you will. And sometimes it's like a disclaimer from Health Canada. Other times it's from the World Health Organization and the information they give you. So we already have, I mean, there's an example of big tech on its own deciding to outsource, truth basically to the World Health Organization. And just imagine if you go one step further and make that a deputization by the state to do the same thing. And I don't think, being able to say it with a disclaimer will even satisfy what countries want. I think they want you to not be able to say it at all.
Oh, no question. And sure. So the proponents of this will say, quite rightly, actually, that this does not suspend the Constitution. Your rights and freedoms are still in place. The WHO doesn't have the power to set the Constitution aside. That is true. But we've already seen that during the first round, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was not very useful. The courts did not come to the conclusion that a lot of these measures violated the Charter, right? So just because the Charter is not being suspended doesn't mean that you're going to have your civil liberties. And if international norms change, and the cause is a global cause, and a Canadian court is interpreting what the Constitution means, then it's just as likely that court, especially given the track record, is going to say, well, of course you still have your rights, but in this case, the infringement of your rights are either not existing or they're justified under Section 1 of the Charter, because after all, we have this emergency, and the WHO has said so. So this plan does not have to suspend our Constitution in order for the plan to be a very bad idea.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. And I'd go back to where you mentioned a few moments ago as being the first line of defense on this, which is the nation state. It's countries that need to have pressure put on them by their citizens to perhaps change or scrap this process. I mean, I'm looking around at the world here, and not to say I have a firm grip on every domestic government around the world, but if I look at the big players, I'm not seeing anyone, with one exception, that I think would push back against that. And that one exception maybe is the Argentinian president. I mean, I know he's an economic libertarian. I don't know if he wants to be the bull in the china shop on the world stage at some of these and say, no, we're not signing on to this. Who knows? Argentina doesn't wield a huge amount of power, but the United States does. And I don't think Joe Biden is going to say no to this. I don't think Canada will. The UK has a nominally conservative government, but as you and I actually discussed in the UK, not really when you talk about all these things. So I don't see any countries that are going going to want to put their necks out and say, whoa, I'm not signing on to this in its current form.
Oh, I think that's a correct assessment. And in fact, it's difficult to know exactly what's going on behind the scenes as this thing is negotiated. But I would guess that a lot of these countries are actually pushing for this for the very reason that it's to their advantage, so that they are set up better than they were last time to do the same kinds of things as last time and worse, like the more targeted prohibition on expression of dissenting views.
So obviously we have to be a bit forward looking here. And we hear, I mean, that clip I played from Justin Trudeau earlier, he's talking about, pandemics for years to come. So, I've gone my entire life without ever having a pandemic until the last few years, as have you, as of, anyone who was born after the Spanish flu, basically. And now we're being told this is just going to be business as usual, which I think is in and of itself a bit suspicious, because we've seen the public healthification of everything. And I think that's another part here that is not really said in the treaty, which is that what they decide to call a public health emergency is a big issue. I mean, we hear people saying that you need to make obesity a pandemic, you need to make climate change a pandemic, and all of a sudden you take these powers and apply them to all of these other things, and we've got a big problem on our hands.
Yeah, no question. This is very broad, discretionary, vague power to declare an emergency, when you feel like it. People have referred to this as the beginning of the biomedical state, and I think they're right. This is a new era. They're normalizing what happened during COVID, and this is bad news. They're obviously, you can see it in Justin Trudeau's comments. They're planning for this to be the normal thing, where the powers that they exercise are going to be powers that they exercise regularly whenever they think it's justified. And believe me, if you have power, the state is going to use them.
All right, Bruce Pardy, it is a fantastic piece in the National Post. WHO Health Treaty, a convenient cover for more government overreach. You are the best one on the army against the technocrats, so we're glad to have you. Bruce, thanks so much.
Thanks, Andrew. Good to see you.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.